So now I would like to introduce Rabbi Nichols and a special welcome after her surgery.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here, and I grew up in Massachusetts, so Thanksgiving was always something that's kind of close to my heart, feeling that I was close to where it had all happened. And I've discovered since then that my dad's side of the family traces back to colonial Massachusetts, not to Plymouth. We came a little bit later, but so I really do feel a connection to this time period, and really enjoyed preparing for today. So I'm glad I'm able to be with you. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So we are asking this question of, is Thanksgiving an American Sukkot? And I've heard people say before that, oh, the Pilgrims were just trying to celebrate Sukkot. That was their goal. They were, very religious, connected to the Bible, and they were implementing a celebration of what they would have known as the Feast of Tabernacles when they had their first Thanksgiving. What I want to demonstrate today is I don't think they were actually doing that, but that there are enough ties to what we know of as Sukkot and our practices of saying thank you to God that we can really see a connection between the Pilgrims and our own practices. So I wanted to start by just kind of setting the scene of what we have all been taught since we were kids about Thanksgiving. And so I have two different paintings here that give us this kind of idyllic picture of the Pilgrims and the Indians sitting together over this meal. And this is really a Victorian notion of how wonderful that first Thanksgiving must have been. This is one image, and then here is another one. And the idea that it was this beautifully planned feast with invitations, and that everybody brought things and it was all shared, that it was probably not quite so organized as we would have imagined. This is the most contemporary description of the first Thanksgiving by Edward Winslow. Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, that so we might after a special manner rejoice together after we had gathered the fruits of our labors. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl as with a little help beside served the company almost a week, at which time amongst other recreations we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and amongst the rest their greatest king Massasoit with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted. And they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor and upon the captain and others. And although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty. And this was written by Edward Winslow in a letter back to England soon after the first Thanksgiving. And we get here the connection of a harvest, that it was declared by the governor. We don't have anything yet about turkey, but we know that they went after some kind of fowl, that the Native Americans joined them and brought deer, and that it was not just the eating, but also other activities, like recreations, including shooting. The second description, and these are the only 2 descriptions we have from people who were present at that first Thanksgiving, is from William Bradford, who was the 2nd governor of Plymouth. And he wrote this about 20 years later than that first Thanksgiving. They began now to gather in the small harvest they had, and to fit up their houses and dwellings against winter, being all well recovered in health and strength, and had all things in good plenty. For as some were thus employed in affairs abroad, others were exercising in fishing, about cod and bass and other fish, of which they took good store, of which every family had their portion. All the summer there was no want, and now began to come in store of fowl, as winter approached, of which this place did abound when they came first, but afterward decreased by degrees. And besides waterfowl, there was great store of wild turkeys, of which they took many, besides venison. Besides, they had about a peck of a meal a week to a person, or now since harvest, Indian corn to that proportion, which made many afterwards write so largely of their plenty here to their friends in England, which were not feigned but true reports. So we see here a real emphasis on the change in their circumstances. The first Thanksgiving happened in the fall of 1621. They've been in America for about 11 months, and only half of them survived the first winter. So this was a real change of circumstances to have anything to harvest at all, and to feel that they were actually able to eat and not be hungry all of the time. So we have these two descriptions. And then I wanted to put up a little chart of some comparisons, and we'll go through them one by one, of Sukkot and that first Thanksgiving of 1621. So first is the purpose, a harvest holiday. So we saw in the two descriptions that both Winslow and Bradford talked about this first Thanksgiving happening after bringing in the harvest. And we know from the Torah that Sukkot was connected to the harvest. You shall hold a festival for the Lord your God 7 days in the place that the Lord will choose. For the Lord your God will bless all your crops and all your undertakings, and you shall be only happy. So a parallel between what the purposes of these two festivals were. The length of time. So we think now of Thanksgiving as a single day, but in the Bible, Sukkot is 7 days. And in the description of the first Thanksgiving, we learn that it was 3 days. So they feasted and were entertained for 3 days. So it was not a sit-down dinner, but a kind of long festival of days. And what season did it happen in? So Sukkot is in the Torah, is prescribed to be on the 15th of the Hebrew month of Tishrei. We remember the first of Tishrei is Rosh Hashanah. And the first Thanksgiving was likely not late in November, as Thanksgiving is now, but was probably in early October. We don't have an exact date, but when you try to piece together the different references in people's diaries, they think it was probably early October. However, a distinction between these two is whether it's specific date or not. So this is a quote from historian Diana Muir Applebaum. The separatists at Plymouth did not create an annual holiday of Thanksgiving. People feared that proclaiming a day of Thanksgiving every autumn might harden the people in their carnal confidence of God's grace, and people might begin to take God's gifts for granted. If a proclamation was expected every year, how is it different from the unbiblical Catholic error of creating fixed annual holidays? So what she's speaking of here, first to just clarify, the separatists are what the Pilgrims were known as during their time. Pilgrim became a term that was used much later. They were the separatists because they were a group of Puritans that believed that you could not reform the Church of England from within the church, but needed to separate from it completely. So they did not believe in creating annual holidays. They did not celebrate Christmas or Easter because that would, in the words of this historian, give you kind of overconfidence in what God was going to give you. You would start taking it for granted. So their notion was much more of, look at this harvest that we've brought in. Now we can proclaim a day of Thanksgiving versus every year we are going to celebrate this. And this reference to unbiblical Catholic error of creating fixed annual holidays, one of their largest complaints against the Church of England, and even more so against Catholics, were the distraction of all of these days for saints and different holidays that were distracting people from the true worship of God. So an extension of that point made by the historian is from another historian, Jonathan Sarna. The Puritans did not believe in fixed holidays. If it was a good season, they would announce a Thanksgiving, but it's not like the Jewish holiday, which occurs on the 15th of the month of Tishrei, Sukkot. They did not believe in that. So in that respect, he says it is different. Another similarity that people make between Sukkot and Thanksgiving is the notion of guests. So in the biblical holiday of Sukkot, in our observance of it, we have a practice of ushpizin, of inviting in guests, and specifically a practice of inviting in our ancestors. And the comparison has been made to the Pilgrims inviting in the Native Americans to be part of this first Thanksgiving. It's a lovely connection. However, if we look at the description, the historians suspect that it's not so much that they sent out, invitations to the tribe and said, please come join us, but that the tribe just showed up. If we look at the description, at which time amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us. Historians wonder if in their celebration and shooting off all of their guns, that actually attracted the attention of the local tribe, and they came to see what was going on. And once seeing that it was a celebration and not something dangerous, many more of them came and stayed. And that kind of goes along with the idea that they came and they saw what they were doing, and then they went out and killed 5 deer and contributed their own part to the feast. But it's less of an idea that from the beginning, it was designed to be this idyllic sense of gathering peoples together that may have been taught to some of us in elementary school. Another point to connect the two is the notion that the Pilgrims would have interacted with Jews. They would not have interacted with Jews in England. Jews had been kicked out of England prior to this period, but the Pilgrims left England and went first to Amsterdam and then settled in the city of Leiden in Holland. And there they would have interacted with communities of Sephardic Jews who were also there for the same reason, for the reason of being able to celebrate your own religion freely. For the separatists, this was a wonderful opportunity for them to go and establish their own church. It also, though, was a challenging time for them because their notion was not that everyone should have religious freedom. Their notion was that they had the correct idea and needed to be able to enact their notion of a church. And so some of the trouble of living in Leiden and why they ended up going to America is that the religious freedom around them exposed their children to influences that were not within their own views. And they felt their children were becoming too Dutch. But in that period, they would have observed the practices of Sephardic Jews. So perhaps they observed Festival of Sukkot and had a sense of what they'd read about in their Bible and now seen some of it practiced in person by the Jews who were around them. The other comparison is just in the name itself that makes a connection for us, that Sukkot is one of the 3 pilgrimage festivals in the Torah: Sukkot, Passover, and Shavuot. So one of the 3 festivals when the people would have gone to Jerusalem bringing their offerings. And then we have this group of separatists who become known as the Pilgrims. That name of Pilgrim comes from a description by Governor William Bradford, who, when he's writing about their departure, says the following: "They knew they were pilgrims and looked not much on those things, but lifted up their eyes to the heavens, their dearest country, and quieted their spirits." So this reference saying that they knew they were pilgrims is where later, when this manuscript was discovered, the name Pilgrims was taken from and stuck. But they themselves would not have called themselves pilgrims. But we have this notion and connection of the Jews going on pilgrimage and the separatists who saw themselves as kind of wandering as part of their religious observance. Related to that is the idea that they saw themselves as Israelites and as the new Israelites. Sukkot, we have two reasons for it. We have both the harvest festival, but also it's a historical reminder that when the Jews left Egypt, they lived in Sukkot, in these dwellings, open dwellings, when they were in the desert. And the Pilgrims saw themselves as kind of the newest Israelites. William Bradford compares the Pilgrims' voyage to the Israelites' exodus from Egypt. Our fathers were Englishmen who came over the great ocean and were ready to perish in the wilderness, but they cried to the Lord, and he heard their voice and looked on their adversity. Yes, let them who have been redeemed of the Lord show how he has delivered them from the hand of the oppressor. When they wandered forth into the desert wilderness out of the way and found no city to dwell in, both hungry and thirsty, their soul was overwhelmed in them. Let them confess before the Lord his loving kindness and his wonderful works before the sons of men. The bold text here is a quotation of Psalm 107. And Bradford is really seeing his group as essentially enslaved and calling out for help. And that in the passage from Europe to America are essentially crossing the Red Sea and wandering in the desert to find the promised land. So imagining all of the hardships that they endured during those first years in Plymouth as part of that wandering and part of the experience of reaching the promised land. And for me to imagine how much more emboldened they felt if they saw themselves as on the way to the promised land, right? That this was not, they weren't alone, that this was all of the suffering that they were enduring was part of God's plan to lead them to the promised land, and that they were creating the ultimate church that they thought was the proper way to worship God. This notion of being the new Israelites extends to the Puritans beyond the separatists, beyond the Pilgrims. And this is a quote actually written by my 11 times great-grandfather, who was a land surveyor in colonial Massachusetts. And the town of Dedham was given land in western Massachusetts, and he went to scout the land. It's what would become the town of Deerfield. And this is how he described the land. So if we think of the surveyors now who are creating very precise maps with all the descriptions of what you would need, this is a little bit more flowery. Having ascended a little hill, apparently surrounded by rich meadowland, from that spot we beheld broad meadows extending far north, west, and south of us. In these meadows we could trace the course of a fine river. It is the best land that we have seen in this colony. Providence led us to that place. It is indeed far away from our plantations, and the Canaanites and Amalekites dwell in that valley. And if they have any attachment to any spot on earth, must delight to live there. But that land must be ours. Our people have resolute and pious hearts and strong hands to overcome all difficulties. Let us go and possess the land. And in a few years, you will hear more boast of it in this colony as a good land for flocks and herds than could ever be justly said of the land of Goshen or any part of the land of Canaan. So this quote really gives us a sense of that extended idea of, and this would have been 20, 30 years after the description of William Bradford, of really seeing themselves as the new Israelites and establishing their promised land. And that is added to by portraying the Native Americans as the Canaanites and Amalekites who have to be routed from the land. So in the book of Deuteronomy, we have the notion, and in the book of Joshua, that the Israelites were coming into the land of Canaan, and God was going to help them get rid of these other peoples, that the colonists saw themselves as the Israelites, and that God was going to help them get rid of the Native Americans who were there because this land was supposed to be theirs. So it really adds this kind of religious sense of entitlement to the land. And picturing themselves as Israelites and imagining perhaps then doing things like celebrating Sukkot that would have been the holidays that were being introduced to the Israelites, is how to then properly worship God. I want to stop for a moment and just see if there are any questions or comments before we move on. And I can't see everyone, so feel free to unmute and ask your question. David?
Yeah, do you see any connection between the sense of entitlement in this document from Joshua Fisher and what I think was the later development in America of the notion of manifest destiny?
There's certainly a connection and a notion that that the other peoples who are there, right, happen to be there, but it is our destiny to have this land. It's interesting, I think, though, that the Pilgrims were actually had probably the best relationship with Native Americans of any early American group for the first decade that they were there. And then it all dissolved into horrible violence in the late 1600s. But that there was this sense of, Joshua Fisher is writing this before most of the violence starts. But if this is their attitude, then it's not surprising that they then get to a point where they're assuming that all Native Americans are enemies and that they have a right to the land. Mm-hmm. Harry or Ruth?
Question was Joshua Fisher Jewish? Could you tell us a little bit more about him?
Sure. So he was not Jewish. So this is my side of the family that is not Jewish. And Joshua Fisher was definitely a Puritan. So part of my family traces back to 1630, coming over with Governor Winthrop, the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And they were definitely Puritans. My favorite quote of one relative is that he says, "Christ's army has no room for tolerationists." That they had this vision we have of the Puritans of coming for freedom of religion was really coming for freedom of their own religion, and had no room for tolerating others. So Joshua Fisher came over with his uncle to set up a blacksmith shop. His father then came over later to run the blacksmith shop, and he himself became a lieutenant in the local militia and was a land surveyor who helped to survey a lot of Western Massachusetts as the Eastern Massachusetts towns had their next generation and needed more land. They would expand out to Western Massachusetts and have towns that kind of connected back to the towns in Eastern Massachusetts. Okay, other questions or comments?
Rabbi Steve Phillips, for those listening that didn't have the privilege of being born in Massachusetts as we did, I remember going in grade school to see Plymouth Rock, which was really a disappointment. It was just a rock surrounded by gates and pillars and things like that. But I was always curious. You said the first winter, half of the separatists had died. How many separatists were there in the beginning?
I don't remember the exact number, but it was somewhere around a little over 100 who ended up coming over on the Mayflower. They had originally intended to have 2 ships coming over together, but the second ship sprung a leak. And so they returned to England and kind of crowded most of the people onto the Mayflower and left some of the people behind. So they ended up with a little over 100 people. And they ended up not just being the separatists. The separatists, by the time they were ready to move to America, had moved to Leyden. They were working factory, well, I guess not factory, but more industrial jobs. They were working in the clothing industry. And so they didn't have funds to fund their own travel to the United States. They had to find support from back in England. So they ended up having to take with them a group of other people who were not in the same religious belief as them. They called themselves the saints, and they called the rest of the people the strangers. So by the time they got to America and established Plymouth, they did have established the Mayflower Contract or Covenant that agreed that everyone was going to do their best. But over that first winter, they ended up, I think at the end of the winter, only 60 people still living. They were later, more ships came with new people and were able to grow the colony that way. But that first winter, they arrived pretty late in the season. So they pretty much arrived and winter started and they had no food left. So it was a pretty dooming beginning to the colony's start. Other questions? Okay. Oh, did you have a question? Bob Wolf?
Yeah, just more of a comment that the change in the attitude of the Pilgrims to the natives, in some degree, I think, was justified by the idea that the Hebrews had gone into the Promised Land with what was known as a commanded war, which we've studied in Sage and in Spice in the past, and that they felt the same thing, that they were justified, that God had commanded them to take this land and commit the violence that was necessary to do it.
Well, and it's interesting to me, I think, that they were kind of holding in their heads that notion alongside the notion that, the archaeological evidence shows that they really wouldn't have survived if the Native Americans hadn't helped them in that first year. So they saw that they could be helpful and important and formed relationships. At the same time, they had this notion that it was their right to be there. I think the other challenge was understanding the politics of the local tribes, that there were so many small groups that had different pacts with each other, figuring out who were the friendly tribes and who were the enemies became difficult, and they actually then, by messing up along the way, turned many of the friendly groups into enemies along the way, because they just started kind of lumping them together, not really understanding kind of the subtleties of the different groups. Ruth and Harry?
And they they also had a superior attitude to the natives because of the lack of culture, not understanding that in the 100 years prior, where there was just minor contact, the transmission of diseases had so wiped out the native population and put them at a point where, it's kind of, we can see this today, how debilitating that is, and much worse in their case. There's some estimates that 80 or 90% of the native population in North America was wiped out in that century. We came in with an attitude that they were, disposable and just not capable of the kinds of sophisticated understanding of life and politics and so forth that we were. And in reality, that was because they had gone through such a disaster. Plymouth itself had been, at one time, apparently the native equivalent of the Cape or Southampton or whatever. It was a summer colony for the Indians. And by the time the Pilgrims got there, the Indians were too weak to move back and forth from one camp to the other in the springtime.
One of the things that I actually learned preparing for today that I hadn't previously read about was the amount of disease that happened before the Pilgrims had arrived. I'd known about later periods where, the British Army used smallpox to create genocide. But even before that, What Bob is referencing is from, I think, 1616 to 1619, some small amounts of contact with European fishermen brought enough disease to the Native Americans in on the Cape that they were basically wiped out. So that the Pilgrims arrived at a spot that had evidence of people having lived there, but was fairly empty because so many people had died, which made it good reason then for the chief Masoit and his group to want to make relationships with the Pilgrims, because they had been so weakened in relationship to other tribes because of the amount of disease they'd experienced.
Yeah, there's a great book called 1491 that talks about this, and it's actually a whole century of contact, especially with the French fur traders that started up in Canada, and then that disease worked its way down, and it was a multiplicity of diseases, and worked its way all the way west to the west coast.
Yeah, it's really extraordinary, I think, how, particularly in our own experience of illness over the last couple of years, to imagine how much illness changed the landscape of these centuries in American history. Ruth and Harry?
Yeah, a couple of things. There was a good series about the Pilgrims on PBS a couple of years ago. I think it was on American Experience, and it's available on the PBS Passport. And I think I remember hearing there that William Bradford taught himself biblical Hebrew so he could read the Hebrew Bible in its original.
Yes, so I will share with us before we finish a couple slides about that. Yes, William Bradford became a little obsessed, I think we could say, with Hebrew towards the end of his life. Leslie?
There. Yes, I wanted to also mention two other things. One is that when the Spanish conquistadors came to the New World, they also brought tremendous disease and wiped out over 50% of the native population of the southern part of North America, Central America, and South America. And it was just deadly, and very rapidly, within 30, 40 years, they were gone. And the other thing that I wanted to mention was that it seems interesting to me that in the 20th century and late 19th century, when Europeans from Eastern Europe, Jews, came to the New World, they talked about America as the New Jerusalem, finding the New Jerusalem here. And for the for the Pilgrims, it was the same thing. It was the new Canaan, the New Jerusalem, and the land of milk and honey. And it was the same thing for them too. It seems that immigrants from every era seem to hearken back to the Bible and justify their legitimacy and their right to come through that.
Well, and I think both their right to come and right to conquer, but also this the strength of the hope that gave them. Because if the Israelites promised land, then perhaps our suffering will end in a good way as well.
And you're right about that. I think that's true. But at the same time, I also think it also was their way of justifying the killing that they did, the stealing that they did, the disenfranchisement that took place, and the negation of native cultures.
Definitely. Thank you. David?
Yeah, I'm struck by Joshua Fisher's comment that land must be ours. That smacks of land appropriation, and from there, it's just a small step towards cultural appropriation, something we hear about a lot, and I think that's as American as apple pie. Living in the South as I have for the last 46 years, I'm often struck by the Baptist notion that this is a Christian nation, and the idea that Sukkot and Thanksgiving go hand in hand is, I think, part and parcel of that idea. And I think we have to resist any such suggestion that this was founded as and should be and is a Christian nation. I see this as part of one picture and the tendencies we have to resist.
Okay, thank you. All right. This is next text is a description from William Bradford of when the Mayflower first reached land. Being thus arrived in a good harbor and brought safe to land, they fell upon their knees and blessed ye God of heaven, who had brought them over ye vast and furious ocean, and delivered them from all ye perils and miseries thereof, again to set their feet on ye firm and stable earth. And then the bold text is again quoting Psalm 107. And I brought this text because I think it demonstrates perhaps a different connection between the Pilgrims and Judaism, in the sense that this is really a description of Birkat HaGomel, the blessing that is said, that is still part of our tradition, that is said when you have been saved from some life-endangering experience. So that this is in some ways their first Thanksgiving, that the moment that they arrived on land, they went on their knees and recited these words from the Bible. And an interesting note that will connect us to what Harry mentioned about William Bradford in Hebrew, in his Bible, which would have been an English Bible, next to this psalm is a note, and it's a quotation from Maimonides, so the Jewish philosopher, and the note quotes Maimonides' rules for when you should say this prayer for Thanksgiving. And the quote from Maimonides: 4 categories of individuals are required to offer Thanksgiving: a person who has been sick and has recovered, a prisoner who has been released from prison, voyagers when they have landed, and travelers in the desert when they reach settled territory. So interesting to imagine that William Bradford had this quotation from a Jewish philosopher written into his Bible, and that really the first thing that they do when they arrive on shore is to fulfill that requirement, according to Maimonides, of offering thanks, because they had certainly been in a life-threatening situation crossing the Atlantic. Now, with what Harry mentioned with Hebrew, this is a picture of William Bradford's handwriting in his journal. So he wrote on Plymouth Plantation, a history of Plymouth, and in the middle of it, he veers off into a discussion of Hebrew. So this text is written out at the bottom. Though I am grown aged, yet I have had a longing desire to see with my own eyes something of that most ancient language and holy tongue, in which the law and oracles of God were writ, and in which God and angels spake to the holy patriarchs of old time, and what names were given to things from the creation. And though I cannot attain to much herein, yet I am refreshed to have seen some glimpse hereof, as Moses saw the land of Canaan afar of. My aim and desire is to see how these words and phrases lie in the holy text, and to discern somewhat of the same for my own content. So William Bradford attempted to learn biblical Hebrew, and this paragraph or triangle that he's written here is surrounded by pages and pages of what looks like a child's notes in a language class, where it's listing Hebrew words and what they mean, just page after page after page, with his attempt to really believe that he was going to somehow become closer to God through understanding the text in its original. And a second image here is of him writing many different names of God in Hebrew writing. So the English, the honorable names of the Most High God, expressing his nature, essence, power, and most glorious majesty. And then that is William Bradford's Hebrew handwriting. And I must say, it's pretty good. So he really had this desire to learn Hebrew and be able to connect with God and I think create the promised land more fully by understanding things in the Hebrew. Sarah? You need to unmute yourself.
Is there a reason or symbolism in the way that he places the word on page? On the first one, it was a triangle. And here, instead of making an indentation on the first line, he indents the second line and brings it again down to a triangle.
So I'm not sure. I don't know enough about calligraphy in that time period, but I suspect that it was some intention to either beautify what he was doing or to symbolize something. Certainly, that's an ancient art of the way in which we write words, demonstrating something besides the words themselves. But I don't know enough about the calligraphy then to be able to surmise what he was doing. So those are the slides I have to share. And I think to just bring it around to the original question of is Thanksgiving an American Sukkot, I really do think the answer is no, that they were not attempting to celebrate Sukkot. I think if they were, we would have seen more specific references to the biblical holiday. However, I think that it demonstrates a connection with this notion of the Pilgrims seeing themselves as Israelites. So seeing that connection is really more significant to their identity, and I think can allow us to understand them in a different way perhaps than we did before, of seeing them as viewing themselves as coming out of Egypt, right? Of coming out of a land of persecution and lack of opportunity, and seeing coming across the Atlantic as a crossing of the Red Sea to create their new land. And then the parallels to Sukkot are more about parallels to how the Bible instructs us to offer thanks, and it was less about establishing a religion where we would see specific holidays and on specific dates, but that it was more about responding to what was happening to them. So this Puritan idea that we would not have fixed holidays, but would react to what's happening around us, I think gives us a sense of the challenge of being Puritans, right? That it was not, you didn't have things to look forward to. You reacted to things as they came. So hopefully you would get to a point where you could feel this, have a day of Thanksgiving because something good had happened, but you were not going to kind of overly rely on dates on the calendar already, because you needed to wait to see what God had in store for you, which made it a difficult life and a difficult beginning to the country, and also to know that it wasn't the sense of I think to remind ourselves as we get to this period of Thanksgiving, and we'll see some of the kind of classic images of Thanksgiving around us, that it both the issues with how Native Americans were treated, and also the kind of idyllic notion that it was for moving to America to have religious freedom, that it was really moving to America to have freedom to just be like they wanted to be and nothing else. So that the freedom and openness to other peoples was not something that they were looking for. It was really their own freedom and their own ability to establish what they considered to be the perfect Israel, to fulfill what they thought was God's word. Sarah? You need to unmute.
I forgot when the present calendar came into being. Were they using a lunar calendar also, the Pilgrims, in the beginning?
They were using, I can't remember what the calendar is called that they were using. They were using a slightly different calendar. But the calendar in terms of Thanksgiving itself, Thanksgiving was established. We don't have evidence that the Pilgrims continued to celebrate Thanksgiving. Again, they didn't believe in annual holidays. They had days of Thanksgiving that were in response to things happening, but not an annual recreation of what they'd done that first Thanksgiving. Different states started to establish days of Thanksgiving, but it was not till Abraham Lincoln that it was a national holiday. And Lincoln established it as the last Thursday of Thanksgiving, Franklin Delano Roosevelt made it the 4th Thursday of November, apparently because of requests by commercial establishments to make sure there was more space for shopping between Thanksgiving and Christmas. So we don't get the Thanksgiving on the date that we know it until Roosevelt. But that along the way, there are different periods and different days of Thanksgiving called, but not on an annual basis. So when we say the first Thanksgiving, it's what we went back and decided was what we're basing it on versus the first of a consecutive series of celebrations. Other comments or questions? Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us today. And I wish you a happy Thanksgiving and hopefully some new discussions at your Thanksgiving table about the meaning of Thanksgiving.
Thank you, Rabbi Nichols. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It
A
was
lot of
very
good-
interesting.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Rabbi, for just a brilliant presentation, so well researched and informative. Thank you again.
Yes, this was just wonderful and so nice to get the real facts.
Yeah,
Yeah,
true.
we hope you feel better and stronger every day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And have a very happy Thanksgiving.
Happy
Take care.
Thanksgiving, everybody.
Happy
Bye-bye.
Thanksgiving, everybody.
And
Yeah.
everyone,
Everybody.
I'm putting information in the chat box about the Hadassah directory. I'm sorry, I wanted to wait till the end. I didn't
Oh,
want
good.
to, right, but
All right.
here's a plug. Make sure you get your information.
Yes, and
do it.
are we going to go into breakout rooms?
I can put you in if you'd like to.
No, I can't even sit
Right.
here.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Yeah, I'm leaving, but feel free to reach out.
Bye. Thank you.
Nancy, I can put the people who are left into a breakout room if you'd like. You're muted.
I'll stay on, sure, for a few minutes.
Or you can just stay right in this room because now there's only a few of you. So
Oh, all right.
let me
right.
take you off the.
Is that Bob and Stephen?
Can you see everybody?
Yes, I can. Shirley is, all right. Okay, wait a minute. No. Oh, there you are. Hi.
Nancy, how do we register for the Hadassah register?
It's in the chat. Go up and chat.
It's in the chat. No, all she says is do it. She
There's a
doesn't-
link too.
Is there
There's a link at
link?
the bottom of the chat.
Yes, there's a link.
Oh, yes, there is.
Do you see it?
All right, I'm going to put you all on mute and I'll just let you visit. Or I'm going to put
Okay.
myself on mute.
And you're still recording. We don't need
Oh, I'll
that
take it
now.
off. Thank you.
Yeah,